Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, somebody did make the mistake of telling me that there was a shuttle in from the airport, and so I just walked off the plane onto the shuttle and disappeared. This is work that really derives from work that I've been doing for quite a while on Canadian criminal justice history. The work is with Cheryl Webster at the University of Ottawa. And I think I've been invited here to tell you that you're not the only country that deals very poorly with Aboriginal people. So that if Aboriginal people in general and in the criminal justice system in particular, and the question that I'm sort of asked myself, and I don't really know what the answer is, and you probably have a better idea than I do, is really, have we learned anything yet? But I think in order for you to understand what it is I'm talking about, I have to spend a little bit of time talking about the peculiar way in which criminal justice is organized in Canada, and also to give you a little bit of history, because the history of Canadian criminal justice up until 2006 was now, I suppose, looking backwards, interestingly progressive. In 2006, we had a change in government, and things changed quite dramatically in a rather depressing way. But in order to understand Aboriginal people in the criminal justice system, I think in Canada, anyway, one has to look a little bit at the treatment of Aboriginal people in general, and then, of course, I'll give you some data on the overrepresentation, which you can already guess about. And I think that the question then becomes, what is it that we will do? Now, Aboriginal people in Canada are as varied as anything that I've heard about here. And my direct knowledge of Aboriginal communities has to do with Aboriginal communities in the northern part of my province in Ontario. So that when I'm talking, what you have to remember is that I'm talking a little bit about what little I understand about those communities, and those communities are very different from other parts. I mean, the Canadian Aboriginal peoples are very different from one another, and I think that that's an important thing to consider. Our criminal law is federal, and that actually has important implication. There is a single federal, we're a federal state, but our national government has full responsibility for all criminal law in our Constitution. The peculiar part of that is that the administration of justice is a provincial responsibility, and to make it more complicated and more bizarre, corrections is divided, and it's divided by the length of the sentence. So long sentences are penitentiary sentences run by the federal government. Short sentences and the remand population are run by the provinces. Probation, most importantly, is a provincial responsibility. And all of our sentences have some form of conditional release, like parole, so that a very tiny proportion of people serve their full sentences. Some are released by paroling authorities. Many just simply get out at the two-thirds point in their sentence. Now, what's important in terms of understanding criminal justice history is that Canada has had a stable rate of imprisonment essentially forever. The figures over on the left, these are expressed as prisoners per 100,000 in the general population. Sometimes people present in terms of adult prisoners per 100,000 adults. What's important about this is the stability. It's essentially 100 plus or minus 15 per 100,000, and it's been that way since as far as we can tell, from the late 19th century, and certainly from, say, 1950 onwards, it is remarkably stable. Now, the other thing that was stable up until 2006 is that the Canadian governments, repeated Canadian governments, both conservative and liberal, both capitalized and uncapitalized, liberal and conservative, the governments have never really believed that prisons are a good place to put people. Prisons are necessary, but they're not good. And so this only goes back, I've only given a few examples. This one's from 1938. Very few prisoners who enter penitentiaries don't leave them as worse members of society. 1938, I could go back into the 19th century and find very, very similar ones. In 1972, there's a reminder from the liberal government that an inmate is always a citizen who is eventually going to return. And the conservative critic in Parliament at that time criticized the government actually for saying, well, it's good for you to say all of these good things about how it's important to treat people as human beings in prison, but at the same time, you better do something about it. And he reminds people that, you know, this is the conservative government, the crime is not just a sordid happening, but rather a result of human behavior brought about by our economic and social conditions. This was clearly the position. In a statement of government policy in 1982, there was a clear statement about using the least restrictive alternatives, a disparaging comment about Canada's high imprisonment rate at that time, which is essentially the same imprisonment rate that we have now, comparing it to the United States. Again, Canadians love to compare themselves to the United States and to disparage the United States. So this is sort of part of our culture. But, you know, the United States affords a glaring example of limited impact of criminal justice responses. This is a conservative government parliamentary committee talking about the costly repressive measures alone failed to deter crime. I mean, there was a clear understanding up until 2006 when the government our new government lost its history and lost its knowledge. Our sentencing system is, since 1996 officially, but prior to that clearly in terms of case law, was a proportional sentencing system. That a sentence was supposed to be proportional, and it's always been accepted that that's the case. So that consistent with that, an offender shouldn't be deprived of liberty unless if a less restrictive sanction can be appropriate. They're very similar and actually much better conditions restricting the use of imprisonment for youth. Our youth justice law is a criminal law under federal jurisdiction, and it is absolutely clear that in legislation, imprisonment for youths and adults is to be the last resort. It is not. Judges are responsible to look for other things, so that. And this is finally moving into Aboriginal issues. All available sanctions, other than imprisonment that are reasonable in the circumstances, with particular attention. This is in legislation to the circumstances of Aboriginal people. This was written into the legislation in 1996. A slightly, I only say slightly, controversial statement, and the Minister of Justice was absolutely clear. It happened to be a liberal Minister of Justice. It could have been a conservative Minister of Justice at that point in our history. Yet the reason for this is as he puts it, the Aboriginal people are sadly overrepresented in prison populations in Canada. So clearly there's an understanding of the problem. There was some public concern about this, particularly in Western Canada. And the concern was exactly what you'd expect, that Aboriginal people were being singled out for special treatment, and that what about other disadvantaged groups? And other people were suggesting, some academics were suggesting, the problem may not really be a problem of sentencing, so why are we focusing on sentencing? A student at the University of Toronto who's now here at Griffith University did a study of this, a survey of this, and she found an interesting thing in terms of Canadian public attitudes about the sentencing of Aboriginal people, that if you gave that clause to people, say that with special, that all alternatives to imprisonment should be looked at, especially for Aboriginal people, if you just gave that to people sort of cold, fewer than half of Canadians approved of it. But give a little bit of context, the context being the socioeconomic conditions of Aboriginal people or their overrepresentation in prisons or both. Canadian people were much more likely to say that provision was okay. So even there, you'd sort of think that there was hope. We'll get to whether that really did anything in a minute. But moving backwards or looking at Aboriginal people, I think that now I'm talking about the little I know about Aboriginal people in my own province, Ontario, in northern Ontario. And the anthropologists in the early 19th century talked about them as an intelligent, peaceful society that avoided conflict, and whenever there was conflict, this is in really remote areas, whenever there was conflict, people just divided up and somebody would move out and they would take up hunting lands and fishing areas in a slightly different place, so that there's these little scatterings of somewhat unstable is the wrong word, of changing family groups in different parts of northern Ontario. But the main thing was that they were certainly described as intelligent and really peaceful. And they resolved, in this particular set of communities, they resolved their problems by just deciding that they were going to move apart, and eventually would typically come together in the summers around the lakes for fishing. But it was clearly a very peaceful, self-governing group situation. Now, our Aboriginal communities, because of our Constitution in 1867, are under the responsibility of the federal government, for better or worse. It's clear that, as they put it, Indians and lands reserved for Indians are part of federal responsibility. Our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which came in 1982, made it clear that rights and freedoms should not be construed as being in conflict with Aboriginal treaty and rights and so on. Again, there's this sort of understanding that we had these treaty arrangements with Aboriginal people after treating them quite badly for hundreds of years, but that that they were not going to lose anything by the Charter. So that the Charter, the Aboriginal people are mentioned in a couple of sections of the Charter. I won't bother you with that. But the policy, quite separate from all of these things, has been an assimilationist policy up until about the 1970s. I mean, these kinds of policies don't change overnight because of legislation. They change over a period of time because of changing beliefs. But essentially, our policy was one of assimilation. The difficulty, and this does relate to the structure of Aboriginal communities now, is that an assimilationist policy is hard to implement, as you well know, in an area where people are spread out all over, in very sparsely populated areas. And the particular problem comes with the provision of health and schooling. And the way we dealt with schooling was in one of two different ways. One was we created communities. Canada created communities, in effect, and said if your kid goes to school in this community, then that's fine. You can stay in this community. Well, that sounds fine, except for one rather important thing, which is the traditional way of life during the winters was in relatively small groups, 15, 30 people in the bush hunting and trapping. Now, you can't have schools scattered around in these kinds of settings. So the government said, well, that's fine too. What we'll do is we'll set up residential schools. And a residential school was a neutral term that's typically run by the churches. Excuse me, they were typically run by the churches. And what would happen, something you're familiar with, is that the government would come in and scoop the kids and take them into the residential schools. And in the residential schools were run on principles of assimilation. So the kids were not allowed to speak their own language. They were in a sense, there was an attempt to westernize them. They were there from September till May or June. The effect of that meant that they would typically come home not really knowing the language, certainly not knowing the culture. They were not allowed to speak among each other, among themselves, in their own languages. There were huge numbers of incidents which we're still dealing with, of abuse, of physical and sexual abuse, unambiguously across the board, cultural, abuse in the sense of a denial of Aboriginal culture. And if you think about this, I mean, there are clear legacies of this. First we destroy the communities, and then we destroy, in a sense, all knowledge of what it means to be brought up by parents. So we have generations of Aboriginal people who were brought up in institutions where all of the kids were essentially, or almost all the kids, were essentially brought up in institutions. Now, we still have Aboriginal communities in small communities across the country. Many of these, and the ones that I know in Northern Ontario, are accessible by air all the time. In the winter, by what are referred to as winter roads. There are roads carved out across the countryside and across lakes and rivers, which are accessible now for a decreasing amount of time because of global warming. And that's the way in which, for many of these, that heavy things are brought in, fuel for the winter, building materials, and so on. They're incredibly expensive to live in, the Aboriginal communities. I mean, it's breathtakingly expensive to buy, a liter of milk in Aboriginal communities now. Now, our population is, the proportion of the population is about the same as yours. It's about 3%. It's very unevenly distributed across provinces and within provinces across different parts of provinces. Like yours, we're talking about large numbers of languages. Many Aboriginal people in Canada now live in urban areas, about half. And the rural areas are largely living in reserve communities, some remote, some not. The ones that I know are the Anishinaabe-Aski Nation, and Anishinaabe-Aski Nation I always thought of as being a sparsely populated area until I read a little bit about your NPY lands, and then I understood what sparsely populated meant. What you see is my notion of sparsely populated on this figure would suggest that it's that ours has about 7 times the number of people per square kilometer as the NPY lands. So I guess I've learned a little bit about what sparsely populated means. It's a huge area, as I said. About half these communities are only accessible really by air, and therefore very difficult to service. Now, the situation of Aboriginal people, I'm thinking of it largely in terms of reserve. I should point out that there are the huge differences, and the huge differences come from, for example, if there's oil on a reserve, and the Aboriginal people have been able to benefit from that, and obviously you have some very wealthy, or relatively wealthy reserves. But in general, I think that the reserve communities could be described as, in this slide, of poor housing, poor health, high rates of alcoholism, low levels of formal education, little what I would call regular employment, which is a difficult concept because of what employment means in a traditional community. And as I said, there are unstable communities even now in terms of people moving in and out and moving from one community to another. Just to give you an idea, this is a couple of pictures that I sort of clipped off the web. But this is a community in Northern Ontario, and it sort of looks like a town from above. It looks like roads. The roads are all local roads. There is no way in this picture, which is in the summer, for a vehicle to get out of this community. The only way vehicles are brought in is over the winter roads. All the bodies of water that you see would be frozen during the winter, and they could come in that way. The typical dirt landing strip, which is the main form of communication. But this is a unnatural community in the sense. I mean, it looks like sort of straight houses and roads and so on. It's something which which has been created by the dominant culture and imposed on the people in this area. One of the things I wanted to show you, I mean, this could be anywhere in northern Canada, but it actually happens to be on a reserve. The reason I wanted to show it to you is because of the satellite dish, the electricity, the telephones, and so on. So these communities are remote, but they're still connected. I'm not sure whether that's good or bad, but it nevertheless means that they're not sort of completely separated from other areas. Again, what you see is sort of small houses sort of scattered around, all bunched up, which makes no sense in terms of traditional life. Health is provided often remotely by, there'll often be a nurse in a nursing station. For anything more than that, doctors would come in occasionally, or people would be flown out if there were an emergency. Telehealth is part of our health system in Ontario. A not unusual house, although it's probably a little bit better shaped than many, would be this one. And if you think about the fact that in this particular community, it would be not uncommon for it to be between 40 and 50 below zero during the winter. A piece of 3/4 inch plywood isn't going to do a lot of, well, it'll do a lot, but it won't be very good in terms of keeping people warm. This is one of the residential schools, and sort of in contrast with the previous picture, what you see is, you know, a big building. These were huge because they were servicing large numbers of communities. The kids would be would be scooped by the RCMP, brought to these schools. They would be living there and taught there, have their culture taken away from them in large groups, and in large groups from different communities. Of course, had no people had no knowledge of them, and taken care of by people, many of whom I'm sure were well-meaning, but again under an assimilation theory. The current situation in crime is what you would expect, which is, as I've mentioned before, Aboriginal people are about 3% of the population. They're overrepresented in serious violent crime by a factor of about 6 or 7, both as homicide victims and homicide offenders. Of course, most of the homicides involving Aboriginal people as victims and as offenders. There are huge differences, though, across communities. And when I say that, what I mean is that some communities will go months without any apparent problems. I was in a community interviewing people about their views on the criminal justice system and their experiences with the criminal justice system. And one of the people I wanted to interview this was a fairly large community. It was about 800 people. And one of the people I wanted to interview was a police officer who was there. And this was just before the police changed in terms of being an Aboriginal policing organization. This was a white police officer who was stationed in this community. I couldn't find him anywhere. And I kept talking to people, and they said, oh, I saw him a while ago, but I don't know where he is, and so on. It turned out he hadn't been in the community for about 6 weeks because he was having an operation on his leg, and for some reason they hadn't replaced him. But there was no particular problem, no particular need. At the same time, other communities would have huge amounts of disorder. The disorder isn't necessarily located permanently in some communities and not others. The communities will sometimes change, and apparent crime will change as well. A few years ago, I did a study on homicides, and I was particularly interested in the sort of homicide rates of people who were, of Aboriginal people who were on reserve and people who were not on reserve. They were essentially the same, which was interesting. But one sort of little sidelight of that is that the homicides were very different from homicides that we saw normally in the rest of Ontario. They were different in terms of who was involved in them. They were different in terms of the way in which they occurred. They were much more likely to involve alcohol, and what they essentially were ordinary disputes and disagreements which escalated, and somebody then would be killed. And of course, if you go back, and this was the area that I was talking about, if you go back to their traditional way of dealing with things, it wouldn't have escalated. There probably wouldn't have been alcohol, but they wouldn't have escalated because people wouldn't have been sort of, in effect, trapped in these communities. As an aside, firearms are a big issue in Canada, as in some countries. And what was interesting, and these are communities where everybody has firearms, is that firearms weren't used as weapons. The firearms are a tool. They were a necessary thing in the communities, but they were not used as weapons. They were less likely to be used by Aboriginal people who had much more access to firearms than people in the rest of Canada, and they were less likely to be used. Overrepresentation is, I won't spend a lot of time on it because it is what you would expect. You have 3% of the population, 25 or 41% of provincial admissions, those would be short sentence admissions, are Aboriginal people. In the federally incarcerated population, you have essentially between 7 and 10 times the representation. We have a little bit of a problem, we have a good deal of a problem in defining what is an Aboriginal person in Canada. When we changed the law to in terms of various things having to do with the legislation on Aboriginal people, people became more likely to identify themselves as Aboriginal people. There are some people who are clearly identified because of law. There are others who are not. So it's very difficult to know sort of in terms of changes, but essentially if you look at admissions to prisons, there's no question of overrepresentation with adults and also with youth. I'll be talking a little bit more about youth because I think youth are an interesting way of looking at this particular problem. The details aren't important. The theories of overrepresentation, at least the theories which people have been talking about in Canada, are really three, and I'm going to add a fourth. The first is obviously that Aboriginal people are more likely to be involved in the kinds of crimes in Canada which lead to imprisonment, serious violence most notably. The second is that there's discrimination in sentencing. To some extent, the law that I mentioned that came in 1996 assumed to some extent that there was either neglect or discrimination at the sentencing process. The neglect is, in a sense, assessed by or is recognized by the law change. The more interesting and more depressing and, I don't know, perhaps something which one can think about is the idea that just in a normal way, our criminal justice system, without discrimination, without neglect or whatever, makes decisions which disadvantage Aboriginal people and perhaps other disadvantaged people. And I'm going to be sort of presenting that in a second. We've had two major Supreme Court cases which have dealt with the section which says that judges have to take into account the Aboriginal status of a person at sentencing. One in 1999 and the other more recently in 2012. And our Supreme Court has been quite good on that in terms of saying, yes, this is something that needs to be done. And in 2012, they tried to clarify that what they were talking about was that they were suggesting that judges use a different method of analysis in determining what a fit sentence was. Thinking of the circumstances of the person, thinking of that our proportionality statement is proportional to the offense and the offender's responsibility for that offense. And judges have huge possibilities of choosing different purposes of what sentencing is. The Supreme Court in 2012 was clearly concerned about the fact that the problem apparently wasn't going away. What they talked about is the fact that that Aboriginal people, perhaps because of lack of opportunities, may, in certain circumstances, have diminished moral culpability. In a sense, the offense becomes more understandable. They made it very clear that this wasn't a race-based discount on sentencing and pointed out that other factors, other groups could benefit from the same kind of thinking, that you have to look at who the person is and why they're there before your court when doing the sentencing. It was interesting that our Supreme Court clearly talked about criminality and colonialism in the same sentence. There was no ambiguity about that. And from a practical perspective, they pointed out that you don't need to, for every case that you're sentencing, sort of go through the history of the treatment of Aboriginal people. You can take judicial notice of that. They did say, though, that judges play a limited role. I mean, I think that they were reasonable in saying that it was a limited responsibility that judges had for the problems that are there, but that what they were looking for was for sentences not to hurt people, not to hurt Aboriginal people given their position in Canadian society more than they could. And it recognized that what they should be thinking about, that the judge has a positive responsibility to think about what can be done legitimately at sentencing, at least not to make things worse. So one possibility is that the judge might focus more than they might focus in other circumstances on the rehabilitation of offenders, that you could focus more on that rather than focusing on deterrence and incapacitation and so on. And the judges in Canada are given a choice on how they think about that. The depressing thing, which I've already mentioned, is that there was no real evidence that things have gotten better, and the Supreme Court made notice of that. Well, I want to give you some figures, and I'm giving them for a particular purpose, because what I think they show is how the criminal justice system, in a sense, is structured in such a way that without any special efforts, it manages to disadvantage Aboriginal people in Canada. I've already mentioned the fact that Aboriginal people are involved in violence. These are, because we have much better data on this from federal corrections, I'm looking at federal corrections where you could get bits of data from other parts from provincial corrections. It's a very similar kind of story. But Aboriginal people are disproportionately there for violence. And of course, we sentence violent cases more seriously in Canada as elsewhere than other kinds of offenses. But if you look at the way in which the system works, I mentioned that we have a system of parole, and Aboriginal people are less likely to be involved in parole hearings. And what that means is that they're automatically going to be released at the 2/3 point in their sentence or thereafter, rather than some point between the 1/3 and 2/3 points. So they're less likely to be involved in parole, I think because they figured that they wouldn't get it. If they do go for parole, they're less likely to be getting parole. So they're less successful. Why would that be? It's probably because when you look at the kinds of things that the parole board looks for, a stable place for them to go to, services in the community and so on, those things don't exist. If you look at the result of who are federal prisoners who are in prison versus in the community, the proportion of both men and women, not surprisingly, in prisons rather than being supervised in the community are larger. We have a system where very serious kinds of offenders, we have a completely nonsensical system, I should say, can be detained until the end of their sentence and then released without any conditions or any support or any supervision. Aboriginal people are more likely to be recommended for that and more likely to have that recommendation from Correctional Services of Canada to the Parole Board of Canada accepted. And when you also look, there's a provision, a very progressive-looking provision in our Corrections Act, which talks about the funding of community programs in Aboriginal communities. There are very few of those. It's enabled in the legislation. It's just that we don't do them. We have very few community corrections, development officers in the communities. I mean, almost none. The result is that in the last few years, things have gotten worse. The increase in the size of the Aboriginal population for men, both in custody and in being supervised in the community, and for women, the same, is larger than the increase for non-Aboriginal people. So what do we know? Well, they're involved in homicide. They're more likely to be in prison. They're more likely to get indeterminate sentences or life sentences. They're not going to get parole. And they're going to be detained until the very end of things. If you look at each of those things and look at other parts of the criminal justice system, you can easily understand why Aboriginal people, at least in Canada, are disadvantaged. In our bail system, the determination of whether somebody is remanded in custody awaiting trial usually has to do with, again, they're having a place to stay, people who might supervise them, and so on. If they're from remote communities or don't have stable housing, the ability to be monitored and so on, they're not going to get bail. At sentencing, you have things like fines and community service, which are just not as available in Aboriginal communities or for Aboriginal people as they are for others. You have a classification system. Our prisons have different levels of classification, of course, and if you look carefully at that classification system, what you find is that in subtle ways, they disadvantage Aboriginal people. Not because Aboriginal people are more likely to be committing problems in prisons, but rather because the factors which, in a kind of mind-numbing, grinding way, are used in these classification systems disadvantage them. The release I've already talked about, the conditions for release disadvantage. So what are you going to do? Well, one thing, I mean, obviously, if you look at real causes, you're into socioeconomic things, you're into the factors which lead to crime, parenting skills and so on. We've managed to do such a horrible job because we have generations of kids being brought up by people who were themselves brought up in residential schools and so on. But you have criteria in the criminal justice system. We can either start thinking about the kinds of things that we've already tried unsuccessfully, which is looking at what could be done specifically for Aboriginal people, or you can start saying maybe we should be thinking about how the criminal justice system itself should be looked at. And the analogy which I'd like to use is that there was a quite interesting report in my province, Ontario, on systemic racism in the criminal justice system about 20 years ago. And what was most interesting in this context, it was looking at race issues generally, not at Aboriginal issues. But they made 177 different recommendations, 3/4 of which had nothing to do with race. They were all things which, if improved, they figured would make things better for disadvantaged, racialized groups. So examples would be looking at bail, to look at the unnecessary use of sureties of a person who is in effect putting up money to guarantee release, for there to be a requirement on police officers to explain why people are not released, and so on. There were a few there were about 1/4 of them did involve race, but what they were looking at was, their race was really just part of the explanation that the attempt in general terms was to make the system better. I won't go into much about the youth justice system, but it's the illustration what I want to use to show you how things might be made better and still have overrepresentation. We have a system of youth justice that came in 2003 after a long, long period of time. I know I'm out of time. It came in after a long period of time which essentially said that we have to do something about the over-incarceration of kids. And there was a lot of talk about this in the 1990s, and the law actually came into effect in 2003. And what we saw during the period of time when this was being considered and when people were beginning to understand what was happening is a reduction in the use of imprisonment for kids. So these are the number of kids sentenced to custody in one province, Alberta. And what you see, the bottom line is the number of Aboriginal people, and the top line is the middle line, the pinkish line is Aboriginal, is non-Aboriginal, the number of non-Aboriginal people. The bottom line is Aboriginal people. I haven't turned those into rates, but what you see is that both of them were decreasing. If you do turn them into rates, what you see is that Aboriginal people are still in a percentage way overrepresented. These data are very similar across other provinces. I won't go into them. But what I'm suggesting in them is that what's happening is that we're using custody less for kids now than we did 10 years ago and 15 years ago. And the situation for Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people has improved. The overrepresentation of Aboriginal people is still unambiguously there in our youth justice system. There's no question of that. And so what I'm suggesting is that in the long term, at least one of the things that we could do, aside from dealing with the basic situation of Aboriginal people in Canada is we can look to try to improve the way in which we run our criminal justice system more generally. And what that will do is to improve it for Aboriginal people. I mean, when you go back to one of those previous slides, you see that there are hundreds fewer non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal kids going into prison in Canada as a result of a law change. And maybe the best we can do while we work on the long-term solutions is to deal with those. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry to have gone over.